So what we call pre-development is typically a long period. It can also be the stabilization, that's more or less the same, but it's a period where a regime is in a dynamic equilibrium. So think again of the fossil fuel regime. We've had it for quite a long time. We try to improve it, make it more efficient in all sorts of ways, insert new technologies, but it's still basically fundamentally the same kind of regime. It's based on the same principles and the same way of thinking and the same kind of structures and routines. At the same time, society, the context around these regimes is changing. So we have resource issues, we have all sorts of economic debates. So there are external changes, but there are also internal changes which we call niches. So there are all sorts of new technologies developing, but also new business models, new practices, and so on. What the typical pattern in transition is that these developments at a certain point can start to reinforce each other, and then a seemingly trivial event can trigger a quite rapid and chaotic change. And we see the example in Germany, where already in the 90s this feed-in was introduced. It slowly helped to build up a renewable industry, creating a labor market, thus creating an interest at the national political level. You had a sort of a social movement going on. There were also sort of developments. And then you had a trivial event like Fukushima, which is not trivial in Japan, by the way. But it didn't create any change in the Netherlands, but in Germany it led to sort of to phase out nuclear, and now they're in the midst of a chaotic process of system change. And they have no idea what's happening, and they're adapting to it, and they're sort of panicking in part, and in part they're excited. And basically the message here is inevitably to go through a qualitatively, substantially an inherently better functioning regime, you need to go through this process of chaotic reconfiguration. And you think of, you can think of all sorts of theories of creative destruction and so on, or cumulative cycles. It's been described in all sorts of ways that these periods are inevitably part of social change and societal progress. Our sort of rather naive idea at first was, if we know this, why then can't we early on start to think about it, talk about it, make a plan, and make sure that these transitions are not so disruptive and chaotic, because they also come with huge social cost. So the original idea was transition management is about early on making people aware of the possibility of a transition so that you can have a smooth one. Well, I can tell you that that worked out quite differently. Maybe sidestep, but you're quite familiar, I think, with the resilience way of thinking. In a sense, our approach is to break through the resilience of the socio-technical or societal regimes. So again, the energy system, this fossil-based centralized energy regime is pretty darn resilient. It's not wanting to change. So basically we say to stay within ecological boundaries, we need to accelerate disruptive changes in social systems. To give one example, this is a Dutch model. I don't know if you have this in Sweden. You probably had something similar, like one phone in your home with a cable attached to it. You remember? It was, now maybe some of you are a bit too young. This you do recognize. The thinking in terms of transitions is really thinking in terms of evolutionary revolutions. That's how we coined the term in the early stages. Because on the one hand, it's a revolutionary change at the systems level, but in everyday practice, it's a rather evolutionary process. And yes, there are shocks and there are moments of disruption or confusion or conflict, but in general, it's a very slow and not very inspiring revolutionary process. So often people start to think about transitions and then think everything should change, or everything can be different, and then they of course get disappointed. But there's a lot of reasons why this is slow. But if you think back, this happened in only 25 or 30 years, and it's a complete revolution in how we communicate with each other, are connected, deal with data, with knowledge. And of course this is also accelerating all sorts of other transitions. So it's also about creating awareness that if you look closely, you can start to see patterns that might add up over time to realize a revolutionary change. And this message alone is for a lot of people opening up brain space, because it's very hard to imagine a different type of future. And of course, if you look back to these kind of socio-technical transitions, then in the process it's now very easy to pick the winner, because we know the outcome, but in the process there was a lot of creative destruction as well. I don't know about Sweden, but in the Netherlands a lot of phone companies made the wrong decisions and lost a lot of investments, and much similar to what's happening now in the energy field, by the way. So that's another interesting element to look at these parallels. So typically we say these transitions are inherently complex and uncertain. So they are also unpredictable. So it's easy to create these historical narratives, but living in terms of sustainability transitions, they are fundamentally unpredictable and uncertain. So they emerge. We use a lot of insights from complex system theory there, that these processes and mechanisms of change are to a large extent emergent and co-evolutionary and self-organizing. That also means that by definition they are unmanageable in a classical sense. So you cannot command and control them, you cannot coordinate them, because there is no coordination center. There's no one authority, there's no one point of origin, and they are basically about change at multiple different levels in multiple dimensions at the same time. So that's also why transition management is a very long term. We got stuck with it, so we try to make a story that we mean a new type of management, but we couldn't find a better term, basically because the idea, this is a way of thinking about complex societal change in which everybody can be the origin of change, or fundamental change. So in a transitions perspective, everybody is a steering actor. Nobody decides upon the whole, but everybody could be a potential policy maker or governance maker. And if we learn something from historical perspectives, then there are hardly any examples of transitions that evolved and turned out as they were planned. And most likely we feel that a lot of the current transitions that are emerging do not automatically lead to more sustainability. There is a number of explanations about it. One important one is that while historical transitions had the promise of progress and increasing quality of life and increasing welfare and also all these benefits, and had relatively weak regimes that were replaced, we currently have very strong regimes with a lot of interest to slow down change. And what are the alternatives? It's more the insecurity, whether you can still afford energy, or food, or mobility, or whatever. So the promise of sustainability for a lot of people is still not the most desirable one, and for the people in charge in the current regime, it's clearly an undesirable one. So it's for us really a challenge on the one hand to think about, okay, if we know what is unsustainable, then of course we want to develop visions and want to create dialogues about sustainability. But we also know from history that whatever we achieve in terms of future regimes, they will produce their own set of problems and drawbacks. So really what we try to do is develop vision on the process of change. So how to prevent new lock-ins, for example. How to prevent new decrease of diversity and inflexibility. How to sustain democratic openness and inclusivity. How to deal with these unequal distributions of power and so on. So what we're looking for is not so much particular kind of sustainable solutions as much as answers to what kind of process of development can be considered sustainable. So what is sustainable development? So let's talk a bit on the agency. Because I've made this clear, I think that the transitions, and you can engineer your way out of it. Some people still think that, and I hope they prove me wrong, but so far I didn't find any good evidence or arguments for that. But at least, and this is partly a question, partly a hopeful optimism, that we can influence or somehow develop the collective intelligence to influence the course, the speed and the direction of these transitions. So what we say is what we try to achieve is influencing the speed and direction of transitions. What we try to do is translate the characteristics of transitions. So they are ambiguous, long-term, complex and structured and uncertain, into basic principles for governance. And they relate to this, how to connect this revolutionary long-term change to evolutionary short-term steps. They're clearly about these multi-dimensional, multi-domain, multi-level kind of processes. There are a lot of about behavioral and organizational change. So learning and social learning and learning by doing and experimentation is a core idea, and we say keeping options open, so you have to create diversity. And there are two main messages that we always try to bring home when we talk to policymakers. One is, you need, besides all sorts of strategies, also sustainable development policies that try to improve the existing system, you also need to create space for exploring system transformation. So and that follows a different kind of logic. So besides trying to improve the existing, you need a plan B, a shadow network approach, a transition management process, whatever name you want to call it, but you need both, and they can reinforce each other, and there can be all sorts of synergies. And the second main message is this last one, because from a transition perspective, it logically follows that not all actors in a system are open to this idea of fundamental change. And traditionally in the Dutch context, but in Sweden as well, and all sorts of other countries, we have a stakeholder approach, basically saying, okay, we involve the existing interests and we try to negotiate and find some kind of a consensus and make some kind of decisions, generally ending up in sort of a middle ground. I would say from a transition perspective, mediocre solution, which is fine in terms of improving the system, but it will not get you out of this predicament. So you need a much more selective and systematic focus on change agents, not only at the niche level, so not only sort of the new emergent small-scale entrepreneurs, new technology and so on, but also within the regime. Because and there's a lot of empirical examples of that. The more you progress in this pre-development phase, the more regime structures start to fall apart, and you start to see differences between the more progressive regime actors that want to become part of a transition and seek their way out, and some that try to hold back. So what we try to do in practice is really create coalitions at all sorts of different levels between forward-looking regime actors and niche actors. This is something tricky for governments, because then suddenly they have to say to people from Shell, you're not invited to the meeting and you're also not welcome. They don't like that, which is also why the energy transition program failed to a large extent. Because what they did was say, okay, yes, transition arena, transition vision, transition pathways. Okay, we organize these groups,